that can go wrong when you're singing that song.
Do your earliest experiences really determine the way in which you behave as an adult? These children are all either 3 or 4 years old. Can what they learn now really have any effect on their adult behavior? Can preschool education be of real benefit? In America during the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democrat president, believed that it could. And as part of his war on poverty, he brought preschool education to the most needy in the country.
Head Start has been one of the most successful social interventions in the history of America. Head Start was created back in 1965 as a part of President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And it was designed as a comprehensive program for economically disadvantaged children and their families. Head Start was designed in a comprehensive way to provide educational services for kids, health services including medical, dental, nutrition, mental health, social services, and parent involvement for the families.
Head Start's intention was to give disadvantaged children a head start in life by providing them with basic education before entering conventional school. Over 500,000 3- and 4-year-olds were given places in various preschool schemes set up at the time. But Head Start did not have any evaluation plan. It simply assumed that preschool education worked and didn't attempt to measure its effects. However, some people did believe that preschool intervention should be evaluated. Detroit was the home of one research project that attempted to look at the effects of this preschool intervention. Many of the children that lived there were educationally disadvantaged by their family's poverty. Extensive psychological testing had shown that poor children often started school with lower IQs than their middle-class peers. In the small depot town of Ypsilanti in the Detroit suburbs, the Perry Preschool Project was begun. David Weikart, a psychologist, began the program to look at the long-term effects of early education on such children. He introduced a preschool program known as High Scope, but he knew that the success or failure of his project depended on the data that he collected throughout.
The initial idea to develop the High Scope program was based on the assumption that we had to do something different than was being done. I was director of special services for the Ypsilanti Public Schools, and in that process I was working with teenage youth and of course elementary school children. And in working with them we were finding a lot of problems with gaining success, particularly with children who were disadvantaged when they arrived at the schools. This whole development of the High Scope curriculum began in the early 60s, and the first program began in the fall of 1962. I had not intended to do it as a research project, but it was set up that way. In establishing the program then, the main assumption was to make it a genuine research project with very careful selection of young people to attend the program and very careful understanding of what program they were experiencing, and then of course very close follow-up. Although I had no intention of doing it for as long as we've done it at the time, I thought maybe a year would be a wonderful length of follow-up. I never dreamed I would be doing a 25-year longitudinal study.
The Perry Preschool program was intended as a short-term research project that would look at the effects of preschool intervention on a group of 123 Black American children. The initial intention of the project was to measure the educational merit of the High Scope preschool program. This child-centered process included the planning, execution, and reviewing of activities. Weikart believed that he could show that this particular program would help its participants. And to do that, he would need statistics. The initial design of the project was quite simple. Children's IQs were measured and a few performance tests carried out. They were put into 2 groups, completely at random.
And probably the most important component was to set it up as a true experiment with true random assignment of sample. And of all the decisions I made, I think that was pivotal in making the commitment to the program and to its long-term value then to others. And what random assignment meant in this case is that we went to every household in the attendance area and found every 4-year-old and 3-year-old who would possibly qualify for the program. Then the child was screened for general ability. If they fell in our category, which was low performance, why they were then eligible in the pool. And from that pool, children were assigned at random to either attend the program or to not participate. And once that assignment was made into these two groups, a coin was flipped, and the coin might have flipped the other way, and the samples would have been reversed. So it was a completely chance phenomena.
By the mid-1960s, the peri-preschool project was showing some remarkable effects. Children that had entered the program group seemed to be improving their IQ scores. Larry Schweinhardt, high-scope statistician, takes up the story.
I first came to HighScope in 1975 as a research associate, and in fact, I think my first assignment was the HighScope peri-preschool study. The program ran from 1962 through 1967. The first thing that we found was an improvement in intellectual performance. Some 12 points or so. The youngsters who had been through the preschool program did better on tests of intelligence.
Unfortunately for the children in the peri-preschool program, this increase in IQs was not to last. After 2 years in grade school, it began to disappear. It seemed that the benefits of preschool intervention were only short-term.
As we followed these children to kindergarten and first grade, then we were surprised to begin to find two things happening. First, the group with the program IQs began to drop. And the group without the programs, IQs began to rise. And by grade 3, there were no differences between the control and experimental on IQ. When the IQs started to drop, we were concerned because the theory would be that we had intervened. We had made the differences in the environment.
Despite this disappointment, the HighScope team continued to collect data, but from sources outside their original scheme.
So we began looking at things like grade retention, placement in special education services, disciplinary problems that the child had in school, of course school grades and other indications of this. As the children got older into junior high, we began to look at self-reported delinquency, police arrests.
These early indications that the HighScope project had stumbled across some unexpected outcomes meant that the research could continue. Although no more children were entering the project, the team were able to carry on collecting data at later stages of the children's lives.
At age 15, we found improvements among the preschool program group in academic achievement. In fact, strikingly, the effect of the preschool program on achievement at 8th grade was stronger than it had been at 1st grade.
The longitudinal nature of the peri-preschool project meant that data were collected at various stages over the 23 years of the project. Information was collated about academic performance and achievement at ages 7, 12, and 15, and about socioeconomic factors at ages 19 and 27. On the basis of these data, their claim about the effects of the HighScope intervention program is quite startling. But what exactly are those claims?
I think that in a way the age 27 data have been very startling. They were foreshadowed by the age 15 data, less delinquency by the group with the program, better school achievement, these kinds of things. They were confirmed by the age 19 data, where we saw those who were delinquent at 15 became criminal at age 19, but then we didn't have much job data and that sort of thing, and certainly very little, if any, marriage data. We did have early pregnancy rates where the group without the program had births earlier and more frequently. But by age 27, the number of births between the two groups are essentially the same.
Probably the single most important finding of the study is that the arrest rate was substantially reduced for the preschool program group. The average number of arrests was cut in half. The number of frequent offenders was cut from 35% to 7%. The number ever arrested for drug dealing was cut.
So the outcome of the high-scope peri-preschool project suggests that preschool intervention can alter the social behaviour of its recipients, and that 2 years of schooling at ages 3 and 4 can alter the way in which these children behave at age 27. To decide whether these claims are valid, you need to examine those data more closely. Let's look at one particular example: the amount of time that the children involved stay on at school. In the United States, the average amount of time spent in school is 12 years. Children begin their full-time education at the age of 6 and stay on at school until they graduate, usually at the age of 18. What happened with the children in the peri-preschool project? One of the children in the control group left school after just 6 years of schooling. The following year, a further 3 non-program children left. In all, 10 children left after 8 years of schooling. These were split evenly between the groups. If you look at the whole thing, the stem plot looks like this. Most of the program children left school after 12 years, but the non-program children left in 2 groups, one after 12 years, but another after only 9. That seems to support the idea that preschool education does have an impact in later life. But you can't rely on stem plots alone. You need to know what the effects of the program are, and the sorts of problems that may have arisen in the collection of the data. A stem plot like this merely represents the data. What you need to do is analyze it, and that can cause problems.
Anyone who tries to study something in the real world, and something as complex as the effects of a total treatment on children, is to be congratulated, because it's very, very difficult. We have enough trouble getting reliable findings in laboratory, tightly controlled settings.
Thank you, Gregory.
It's always possible to make a mistake. You can report a finding that is there by chance because people, the subject matter of our discipline, people differ so much anyway.
Good morning, Martha.
So, to get a clearer picture, you need to analyze the data more carefully. These children were just a sample of those who might have had the high-scope intervention. In order to generalize the results to a wider population of children, you need to do a statistical test, like the Mann-Whitney test. Using it enables you to decide whether the difference in the sample was due to chance, or whether the program does indeed have an effect. But first of all, you need to decide what the null hypothesis is.
I've always thought of the primary question here being simply, is the preschool program having an effect? Which means, is the preschool program group doing better than the no program group?
All right.
You can use this as the basis for the null hypothesis, that the median number of years in school is the same for both program and non-program children. There's also an alternative hypothesis, that on average, program children stay at school longer. But when can you say that the difference is statistically significant?
The usually accepted level of statistical significance would be 5% or less. We usually use computer programs that determine the exact level of significance so that we can see what level it stands at, which could be less than 1%, less than one-tenth of 1% even. Obviously, the lower that number, then the greater the probability that you've got a real effect rather than a spurious effect, an effect that occurs by chance.
Is Ypsilanti a long way from here?
Yes.
About how long will it take?
The result of the test for this set of data, using the 5% level, showed that on average, the children receiving the preschool program stayed on longer at school. But this conclusion doesn't apply at the more stringent 1% level. At the 1% significance level, you're unable to rule out the possibility that the difference in the sample was merely due to chance. However, could there be a difference based on gender? You can look at the data for males and females separately, but is that appropriate?
There is a great deal of discussion that maybe preschool program affects girls, for example, doesn't affect boys, or we have these kinds of things. Even some independent analyses of our data have said that, oh, it's more important on women than on men. And I basically disagree with that. I think we have to accept the fact that it affects them differently, that there's a differential impact. But to say that it affects one and the others isn't true. We know in terms of school graduation rates that more girls with the program graduate from high school. So there's a huge difference there. While boys, it's almost equivalent. So there's no significant difference on boys. So does that mean the program has no impact? No, it just shows up in different ways. Boys stay in school because that's where the action is. Girls have a problem in school, get pregnant, get assigned to special education, don't have success they want. They don't have to stay in school for the action. That's at home in the neighborhood, and they go home to the neighborhood. So it's differential in its impact, yes, but we can't. I think we have to use the whole outcomes as a basis for looking at that.
Here are the STEM plots for the male subjects. The two halves look pretty much the same. Most boys left after 12 years of schooling. This is supported by the statistical test that was carried out. There's no evidence that males that take part in preschool education stay any longer than males that don't. Now let's look at the STEM plots for females. This time, the data looks altogether different. Look at the girls that did take part in the program. Most of them left school after the average 12 years. If you look at the furthest extremes, you even see girls that carried on to postgraduate courses. But when you look at the non-program group, the difference is startling. The largest number of non-program girls left school after only 9 years. In fact, this time, you could reject the null hypothesis at the 1% significance level. That's pretty strong evidence that the difference in the sample wasn't due to chance. On average, females that have preschool education are likely to stay at school longer than those who don't. And that's why there's evidence of a difference in the original STEM plot. But criticisms of the peri-preschool project have not only focused on gender differences.
There were 2 young children in 2 families whose mothers worked. And about the 6th week of the program, we reassigned them from the experimental group to the control group, because for all intents and purposes they were the same. Some people looking at the project have criticized that because of the change then in the character of the experimental group, because of the shift of 2 children over. Others have said it didn't make any difference, and our solution to this was to in fact study those 2 children. What we found is that they are among the best performing of the control group, the group without the program. And so at this point I can do nothing about them. I could remove them from the study and thereby increase the difference between the control and the experimental, because I would take out 2 of the higher performing children. I could reassign them back to the experimental and increase the experimental from that side. Or I could just leave it as it is, which is the most disadvantaged method of using the data, because it narrows the difference between the 2 groups.
IQ tests were invented, in fact, to predict educational success, and they do so quite well, especially school achievement. And what attracted me to the HighScope project was the absence of a relationship between IQ scores and school achievement. In fact, the IQ scores of the preschool kids were no greater than that of the control group as early as the 1st grade, almost only 2 years after the end of the project. And yet, just when IQ scores disappear, or the differences between the 2 groups disappear, they report that there begins to emerge an entire constellation of effects in favor of the preschool children, many of which are usually those that are well predicted by IQ tests. Families come and go from the project. You don't have tight control over how the program is run every day. You have no control over how the parents deal with the kids in the program. I think the intention of the design was good. I think their intention to study preschool education was good. But a lot of things happened along the way, including kids dropping out, and I think that was a problem as well for them.
Despite criticisms of the way in which the peri-preschool data were collected and analysed, The impact of the study has been immense. It's gone further than HighScope and has had a major impact on Head Start, despite the very different form of intervention.
The studies by HighScope have been extraordinarily useful in helping policymakers and advocates expand the availability of preschool education in America, especially to our poorest youngsters. I think actually that Dave Weikart and Larry Schweinhardt at HighScope have used statistics in a brilliant way, and all of us at CDF and other advocates have worked with them to increase the federal investment in Head Start. They've also done extraordinary work with the nation's governors. Throughout the 80s, they spent time visiting with governors and using the peri-preschool statistics to convince governors to make investments that now total, I believe, close to $800 million.
Other Head Start advocates are worried about the reliance on statistics from such a different form of intervention. How far can HighScope's results be generalized to other preschool programs?
It's extremely important to note that HighScope and programs like it are not Head Start. And although both are programs that focus on preschool education for disadvantaged kids, there often is a kind of blurring between those two, and the blurring is not appropriate. This is a program that was much more intense, much more controlled. The curriculum was much more carefully sort of monitored than Head Start in general.
The long-term evaluation of the peri-preschool project has resulted in a lot of discussion around the evaluation of preschool programs. Head Start are now drawing up plans to evaluate their programs. They still believe that preschool education is essential to overcome the effects of poverty. But they also realize that the use of statistics is necessary to argue their case for future investment.
I think statistics is very important to educational development altogether, but one needs to demonstrate that things work and that they're worth what's invested in them. And you do that through what I would call hard-nosed program evaluation, and those are statistically based.
So the HighScope intervention does work. But do other forms of preschool education have a long-term effect on children? To make that decision, you have to evaluate the effects of a project. And to do that, you need statistics.
I love you, you love me, we're